an amendment that would ban it, make it a crime to point lasers at airplanes. That point passed by a vote of 96-1. General speeches today, morning business as the Senate comes in, live on C-SPAN 2.
Let us pray. Almighty God, strengthen the desire of our senators to serve you. May they join you in bringing peace, justice, and order to our nation and world. Confirm the wisdom of their service in the joy they receive from doing your will. Lord, fill them with your Spirit so that they can discover creative ways to meet the challenges of our time. Give them courage to change their minds when it is needed in order to travel along a more productive path. Let integrity be the hallmark of their characters. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read the communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., February 4, 2011. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Mark Begich, a senator from the state of Alaska, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Following Leader remarks, the Senate will proceed to period of morning business. Senators will be allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each this morning. We've made significant progress on the FAA authorization bill this week, and we'll make more progress next week. The Finance Committee is going to report out a bill on amendment legislation on Tuesday, funding for this most important piece of legislation. We hope to complete action on this bill early in the week of the 14th. Today I will continue to work with the Republican leader on agreement to vote on Monday on confirmation of several executive nominations. There will be no roll call votes during today's session of the Senate. Mr. President, there are 3 bills at the desk due for a second reading.
The clerk will report the bills en bloc.
S-289, a bill to extend expiring provisions of the USA Patriot Improvement and Reauthorization Act of 2005 and so forth and for other purposes. S-290, a bill to extend the sunset of certain provisions of the USA Patriot Act and for other purposes. S-291, a bill to repeal the sunset provisions in the USA Patriot Improvement and Reauthorization Act of 2005 and so forth.
Mr. President, I would object to any further proceedings with respect to each of these 3 bills.
Objection is heard. The bills will be placed on the calendar.
Note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Akaka.
U.S. Senate comes in on a Friday morning for morning business, general speeches. No likely work today on the bill they've been spending much of the week on. That's the FAA reauthorization bill. But a number of amendments pending, and votes on those, some of those amendments, next week, Monday evening the 7th, Tuesday morning, February 8th. And Senator Reid has said it's his hope that the FAA bill can be completed by the week of February the 14th. They did pass yesterday an amendment that would make it a crime to point lasers at airplanes. CQ writes that that measure, adopted by a vote of 96-1, would establish penalties for violations including a maximum 5-year prison sentence. The amendment would exempt certain research and development activities as well as individuals sending emergency distress signals. One of the amendments passed so far in the debate on the FAA reauthorization. So the Senate will wrap up their week today and then be back on Monday. The House, meanwhile, has been out all week, and they will return on Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Live coverage, of course, on C-SPAN. The Senate next week, late next week, will have their retreat, at least Democrats will, in Charlottesville, Virginia. U.S. Senate likely to be in periods of quorum calls throughout the morning. They're in morning business, general speeches on the floor of the Senate. They will return to debate on the FAA reauthorization bill early next week, with votes possible on Monday and on Tuesday. While the Senate continues in this quorum call, we're going to bring you part of a conversation we had this morning with Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi.
Is Senator Roger Wicker, Republican of Mississippi. He has spent his last term in the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and has now moved on to Armed Services. He also serves on Commerce, Banking, and Veterans Affairs. And he's part of the leadership team as a Deputy Republican Whip for the Senate. I actually want to start with your perspectives on Egypt. As you sit and watch this from these thousands of miles away, what are your concerns for U.S. interests in that region?
Well, actually, Egypt has been a linchpin in our policy toward Israel, and that is my major concern. Of course, we don't want to see what happened in Iran 3 decades ago happen in Egypt. It's clear to me that Hosni Mubarak is on his way out. The question is, who's going to replace him? And this may happen today. Will it be his new vice president, the first vice president that he's had during his term? And in that case, it would be a member of the military, someone who's in charge of this vast military establishment that controls 40% of the gross domestic product of Egypt. In that case, I think it would be a stabilizing transition. But to the extent that there's a group that takes over, including the Islamic Brotherhood, then we've got real trouble, and I think we've yet to see what's going to happen there. But I do know this: Egypt is right next door to Israel. They signed the Camp David Accords with President Sadat back in 1978. And since that time, they've been a reliable partner in helping us make the case that Israel has a right to exist, and the entire Arab world shouldn't be at war with Israel. And that's been an important stabilizing factor in the region.
Okay, let me bring it home to U.S. politics. This is Jeff Zeleny in the New York Times this morning on his political memo column. GOP hopefuls leave Egypt crisis to the president. Question for you is it appropriate or a missed opportunity?
For GOP candidates, I think it's to their credit that they haven't played politics with this. This is a time for extreme prudence and caution. We have one president at a time, and we have one Secretary of State at a time. Now, Congress has an opportunity to weigh in. We certainly have the power of the purse with regard to this $1.5 billion in foreign aid that has gone to Egypt year after year since Camp David, and most of it comes back then to the United States in the form of military manufacturing. But the president and his administration are the principal agency, entity that conducts foreign policy. And frankly, I think as a matter of doing what's in the national interest, it's probably best not to inject presidential politics into this.
The Senate yesterday took up a resolution, a sense of the Senate resolution on the transition in power there. What good does that do? What is the point of that?
I wonder myself. There was very little debate, as people who watch closely know. Basically, Senator Kerry, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator McCain put it together, basically got it blessed by leadership and put it on the hotline. And I dare say most members didn't even have a chance to read it in its entirety. I think it does express, though, the general sense on Capitol Hill that we realize a transition is on its way. It needs to be done quickly, and it needs to be done in an orderly fashion. And the people of Egypt are entitled to a democratically elected government. So basically, it struck general principles, but in terms of making news or taking a position. I think the significant part of it is that the transition should begin almost immediately and not wait till the end of President Mubarak's term.
More or less in support of the White House's position.
I think you could say that.
Let me give the phone lines to folks watching around the country, and Senator's with us for half an hour. We will talk foreign policy if you wish. Certainly, if you want to talk about things here at home, he's here to take your telephone calls. 202-737-0002 for Democrats in the audience. For Republicans, the line is 202-737-0001. And for Independents, 202-628-0205. Okay, let me move to the budget. The House is taking the lead, as it does, on budget issues. And yesterday, we saw from the new budget chairman his first line at budget cutting. It's really interesting watching the morning newspapers, and if I can find them pretty quickly, I'll show you. Depending upon perhaps the editorial point of view of the paper, the headlines vary differently about whether or not this is an achievement to find the budget savings or whether or not it doesn't meet the promises made, here we are, during the election campaign. Here is New York Times, $32 billion in budget cuts proposed. House panel figure falls short of Boehner's $100 billion vow. And from the Wall Street Journal, House GOP plan would require big cuts. All right, I want to talk to you about the sentiment among Republicans on Capitol Hill in both houses, both chambers.
Okay. Well, I think the story there, though, is that it's a new direction. Whether it's an inadequate first step or not, it can be debatable, but the significant thing is that this is a new day, and we're not talking about new stimulus spending projects, new appropriations to be sent to states to help them out of their financial hardship. This is a new budget chairman, and the Republican minority in the Senate feel this way also. That are searching for ways to cut the budget and cut expenditures. So it's the direction that it's the about face and the new direction that is the bigger story there.
Will the Republican minority in the Senate find enough like-minded Democrats for their point of view?
Well, I hope so, and we'll see. That's why we have votes, and that's why we sort of have test votes. Of course, I think repealing the Obama health care bill would be a long-term savings, and that's why we had a vote yesterday or earlier this week. It would have taken 60 votes. It would have been an amendment to a rather strange amendment to the FAA reauthorization bill, but it was the chance we got, and it was an opening salvo. So we will be seeing if we can take our 47 Republicans in the Senate and get 4 or 5 Democrats to move us in the direction of actually cutting the budget. The first test is going to be on the continuing resolution, and that's next month. I think it says a lot that this new majority in the House of Representatives is not simply saying, for the rest of this fiscal year, we're simply going to ratify the appropriation levels that we've already had. Basically what we're saying is no, even this, just the continuing of the status quo is not acceptable. We're going to cut from that level. It's difficult to do, as Chairman Ryan probably demonstrated yesterday. But I think the cuts are going to come, and in many respects, it's not going to be a lot of fun. But we have to look at the bigger picture, and that is with a $14 trillion debt, our country really risks economic ruin. And so things have gotten so far out of hand, and the fiscal ship has gotten so far out to sea. We're going to have to do some painful and difficult things, and make some adult decisions to reel this thing back in.
Okay, let's get to our viewer calls for you, Senator Wicker, beginning with Canton, Ohio. Mark's the Democrat. You're on the line for the senator.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, Senator, I have a comment and a question for you. By all accounts, this movement in Egypt was started by anonymous students using modern devices, electronic devices, Facebook, whatever. I think that Obama's speech in June of 2009 at Cairo University sort of stirred these students up, talking very high ideals about democracy and whatnot, but I do think it stirred them up. I also think that every American media outlet I've seen, the journalists over there, with their high ideals, I believe the Israelis called it professional narcissism, has acted like cheerleaders stirring up this chaos over there. But my question to you is, what do you think? How do you think President Obama's administration would react? I include you as part of the government. If Mubarak called for President Obama to step down because he has a lot of opposition in this country. Thank you for taking my question.
Well, the quality wasn't very good on the sound there. I think the caller has a point. Internationally, people look to the United States for broad principles, and certainly we ought to be standing for freedom and democracy. At the same time, we're promoting stability. But the point being made is, what would we care in the United States if a foreign head of state suggested how we handle our domestic policy? So I think we need to be careful in that respect, and to the extent that we're seen as dictating what people in a sovereign country should do, we have to be cautious of how that is received by the various factions over there. So the caller makes a good point.
Next is Street, Maryland. This is Bonnie, who's a Republican. Bonnie, you're on the air for the senator.
Yes, I have. This guy almost said, my comment is the news media is feeding the fire over there. And my question is, how can our government think that they have a right to tell other countries who to put in power when our government, in fact, is taking away more and more of our powers, like the health care, what we to eat, what we to use, and what kind of cars. So we're no better than they are, but yet we want to tell them what to do. What do you think of that?
Well, again, that's a follow-up point, and I guess we have a moment of bipartisanship with our first two callers today, Susan. Of course, the caller also has some very real concerns about domestic policies, and they're well taken. So I think I'll let it go at that. It is a fact that the United States is a leader on the world stage, and to a great extent, they look to us. It's also a fact that the American taxpayers, as a way of being a part of a process to move toward Middle East peace, the American taxpayers have paid $1.5 billion a year, or equivalently that amount, for quite some time. So we do have interests over there, and I think it's important that we express our opinions, and oftentimes the United States, in the form of our President, our Secretary of State, have been able to move in and sort of preside over very difficult issues and provide a forum for getting them straightened out. And I hope that's what we're doing, rather than sending a signal that we know what's best for local governments.
Next call for Senator Wicker comes from Petersburg, Virginia. This is Robert, an independent.
Good morning, Mr. Wicker.
Good morning.
You know, I see a lot of parallels here with this stuff over in Egypt, and people here in this country, a lot of people over here sympathize with them. And, you know, I think it's going back to when George Bush was put in office by, you know, not by the majority of people, because they voted for the other candidate. But, you know, we see government now is being manipulated and taken over, and basically the government we have now is working only for the wealthiest people in this country. And I think it's a lot of people out here in this country now feel like they need to get up and watch too. But you know, you said a few minutes ago that you ought to, well, that Obama and the administration has to deal with this. But you know, just since the first of the year, it looks like the Republicans should be involved with this. You know, they just want to drop it all over on the Democrats now. You know, I would think that y'all, you know, be a little bit more sympathetic about, you know, the whole, everybody in the country instead of just the Republicans and the Democrats. But thank you.
Well, we do have a vested interest over there. We have a strong ally in Israel. For my part, and I think for speaking for most of my constituents, we'd like to see Israel have an opportunity to survive and have their own country over there and live in a peaceful Middle East. So it is, and again, we've spent our own taxpayer dollars trying to accomplish that. The point I was making about Republicans sort of not politicizing this issue is that it is a very, very volatile situation, and extreme prudence should be used, and for that reason I would think that observers and American voters such as you would be pleased that presidential candidates are not coming in and making a political issue out of this. That's the point I was making.
Different subject. Front page lead story in USA Today this morning. Military foreclosure rate up 32% over 2008. More than 20,000 veterans, active duty troops, and reservists who took out special government-backed mortgages lost their homes last year, the highest number since 2003. The housing crisis, they write, has hit military families particularly hard, in part because of transfers and the loss of civilian jobs left behind by reservists. I put this on the table not so much to respond to this, which you may not have read yet.
Right, I haven't seen that.
But just to talk about your goals in taking an armed services seat, what your attitude is with the concern about the budget, about what you want to do for military service people and their families, and what's the right, I guess, program for people who are making sacrifices when we've got all these budget problems at home as well.
Okay, actually, let me clarify. I'm continuing on the Armed Services Committee. I had sort of had an extra duty with Foreign Relations for the last 2 years, but I'm continuing. Also, I'm a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, so we're very concerned about our veterans. And actually, I had a Gold Star mom in my office yesterday.
Explain for people who don't know what that is.
Her son had been killed in combat in Iraq. And really, basically, she didn't come there with an agenda for the Gold Star Mothers organization, but she did want to communicate to me that as we make budget cuts, we don't need to disadvantage our troops and their families. And I think that's a legitimate concern. I think everything has to be on the table. And I think that there are expenditures in the Pentagon, perhaps that are not directly related to what we're doing in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and not directly related to taking care of our troops and their families. And I think we can make cuts there, but we do need to be careful. I had not seen that article about the foreclosures, and I'll have to say that it's disturbing to hear that, and I'm sure we'll look into it, and perhaps there's a solution, but overall it may be a function of the housing market and the fact that potential buyers can't get credit, and they can't come in then and buy the homes that the military people are offering for sale. We need to look further into the details, but it's a disturbing headline, and I appreciate you bringing it to my attention.
Question for you, as you look for ways to trim the budget, is the Veterans Health System sacrosanct?
No, I don't think anything should be sacrosanct, and that's the reason I'm encouraged by the determination to have legitimate oversight. Oftentimes, we're so busy talking about legislation that's being offered and working out the details of a new bill or a new resolution or a new appropriation that we fail to take the time to exercise our role as a function of the power of the purse to see how money is being spent already, how programs are working already. So, of course, Congressman Darrell Issa, a real aggressive Republican from California, has been named the chairman the Oversight Committee in the House of Representatives. I know the Speaker has said this is not going to be gotcha investigations trying to put people on the spot, but it's going to be legitimate oversight into how our programs are working, and I think every program, including Veterans Health, including all the various functions of the Pentagon, and including our entitlement programs, should be the subject of very thorough oversight. And I think the American people may be pleased when we're able to weed out some programs that maybe aren't getting the results that we had hoped for.
Next call is from Fort Lauderdale. This is Greg, who's a Democrat. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You know, I've spent some time in Egypt, and one of the things that we really do need to be aware of is that you have an elite, encrusted political class in Egypt that refuses to really, over the years, ever since President Sadat.
Unanimous consent that a quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to speak this morning in support of Amendment 32. This amendment introduces new language to Section 320 of the Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Bill concerning unmanned aerial systems. It has been offered by Senator Ensign, Senator Conrad, and myself. It calls for the FAA to develop a process to integrate unmanned aerial systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, and remotely piloted aircraft into the national airspace system. We've all seen on television and read in the media about the remarkable role that unmanned aerial vehicles and remotely piloted aircraft are playing overseas in the security of our nation in the war on terror. They achieve military objectives without putting our men and women in uniform in harm's way. Unmanned aerial systems will continue to play that vital role in our nation's security abroad, but they are also poised to play a big role here at home in other important areas as well. Areas like enhancing our ability to patrol our borders and secure vital infrastructure, fight crime, detect wildfires, provide valuable crop data for our farmers, and respond to emergencies like floods and fires. I can give you a practical and personal example of their value. 2 years ago, when my home state, along with our neighbor to the east, Minnesota, was battling flooding in the Red River Valley, and many of you throughout the country saw this on television. Predator aircraft on loan from Customs and Border Patrol gave us real-time data on the status of ice jams and overland flooding all along the river, and made a real difference in helping us to fight those floods and protect our citizens. That vital information enabled both states to deploy resources in a timely and efficient manner, and made a real difference for the people of North Dakota and Minnesota and throughout the region. Just a few years ago, that would have been the stuff of science fiction, a vision of the future. But today, it's reality, and we can do much, much more. In fact, unmanned aerial systems are about just that. They're about the future of aviation technology in America, and I'm proud to say that our state of North Dakota is playing an important role in that endeavor. The Grand Forks Air Force Base in northeastern North Dakota is already home to Predator B aircraft that fly missions for Customs and Border Protection, and will soon be home to the Global Hawk as well. Right now, overseas Predator missions are being operated from by our North Dakota Air Guard in Fargo, North Dakota. The Grand Forks Air Force Base is also partnered with the state's Unmanned Aircraft Systems Center of Excellence and UND, the University of North Dakota School of Aerospace. These programs provide access to state-of-the-art training and technologies for the base. Our Center of Excellence operates up to 9 unmanned aircraft and is in the process of installing UAS simulators and training programs to prepare a generation of young pilots for this rapidly growing field. The program is designed to combine the visionary thinking of researchers with the practical energy of entrepreneurs and businesses. In fact, the commercial applications of unmanned aircraft and the opportunities for America's aviation industry are enormous. UAV spending will more than double over the next decade, from current worldwide UAV expenditures of $4.9 billion annually to $11.5 billion annually, totaling just over $80 billion for the next 10 years, according to the 2010 Teal Group market study. Here and abroad, our nation has led the way in this breakthrough technology, but we need to do more. We need to seize the opportunity, and this amendment provides our opportunity to not only maintain but build on that leadership position. This amendment will authorize the FAA to set up pilot projects in the United States that will develop a plan for these aircraft to fly safely, either concurrently or in layered air zones in our nation's skies. We need them to develop air traffic requirements as well as certification and flight standards for unmanned aerial systems to fly in the national airspace. We're already flying UAVs in airspace all over the world. Now we need to open the skies for them right here at home to make our nation more secure, our communities safer, our economy more dynamic, and create jobs and opportunity throughout our country. If we don't, you can be sure that other nations will. The goal is to make UAVs, with all of their remarkable capabilities, a fully functioning, fully empowered component of America's aviation system. Mr. President, American industry and ingenuity can continue to lead the way. They can continue to lead the way forward in the world of aviation, but we must provide the environment that enables our aviation industry to do it right here at home. This amendment will help us do just that. I strongly urge support for this amendment. Thank you. At this point, Mr. President, I will yield the floor. And I also suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Senate ended today and some debate on the FAA reauthorization bill, but largely in a period of morning business, general speeches throughout the morning expected. And while they continue in this quorum call, we're going to bring you a conversation we had this morning with New Mexico's Jeff Bingaman.
Back to the table, the chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, Senator Jeff Bingaman of New Mexico. And Senator, I do want to start with Egypt, but then I want to get to domestic policy. We keep reading concerns about the effect on the U.S. oil supply of events in Egypt. How real are those concerns?
We had a hearing yesterday in the Energy Committee and had several experts there talking about that. The consensus, I think, was that there's no immediate threat to either oil production in Egypt or transit through Egypt. So I think that the concerns are understandable, and that anytime there's a major geopolitical problem, you see fluctuations in the price of oil, but I don't think we're going to see a disruption of oil from that part of the world.
Even before the crisis in Egypt erupted, we were hearing stories that we might be seeing $4 a gallon gas prices in the next months. What's causing that?
Well, again, the consensus of folks at our hearing yesterday is that it's primarily the rapid increase in purchases and demand from emerging countries, primarily. There's not a great deal of increased demand from the United States or from Europe. But China, India, these countries continue to grow, continue to buy more automobiles. The demand for oil keeps going up in those countries, and that, of course, affects the world supply.
We heard the President speak about energy, renewable energy in the State of the Union, with setting a goal for the nation. You were asked to come meet with him in the White House this week about energy policy. What can you tell us about that meeting?
Well, just so we talked about some of the issues he discussed in his State of the Union speech. He talked about how we should have a goal of producing at least 80% of the electricity that we consume here in the country from renewable sources and from other clean sources. And he specified nuclear power, clean coal, and natural gas as qualifying in the way he was defining it. So we talked about that and how we need to do a lot of consultation to see if we can come up with agreement on how that might be done, or what legislation would be appropriate to try to implement that. Talked about his other goal, which he talked about in his State of the Union speech, of having 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2015. And of course, that's an ambitious goal. I think he recognized that, and I think everybody else does as well. But it's certainly a worthy goal, and one that I'm anxious to try to find ways to help us achieve.
Well, moving to the Senate and what's doable, as the point person this year for energy policy, what do you want to come out of this debate with? So what do you think is achievable?
Well, I'm not sure what's achievable yet. We haven't had enough time to really consult. But what I'd like to see us do is to get a bipartisan consensus on legislation in each of these various areas. We can do much more in this country about energy efficiency than we have done, and that's not only efficiency in transportation, but efficiency in buildings. The President spoke about that yesterday in his trip to Pennsylvania, about his desire to see us do more to encourage building efficiency and appliances, equipment, manufacturing. In all of those areas, I think most experts say that we are not near as efficient in our use of energy as, for example, the Japanese are, and many of our European allies. So there's a lot can be done there. There's a lot can be done on the production side. We need to be sure that the proper regulations are in place so we don't have another spill down in the Gulf. That's an issue we've had a hearing on already in this Congress. We still need to pass legislation to implement some of the recommendations of the President's new commission.
On nuclear power, which you have been a supporter of, how do you assuage your concerns about storage and proliferation?
Well, I think the record of safety in nuclear power plant plants in this country is pretty good for several decades, and we obviously need to keep a focus on that, but I think we've got a good record there. Proliferation issues we need to continue to be worried about. We have nuclear power, a lot of our allies do. We need to worry that it doesn't become that much more widespread in some of these countries that are particularly volatile and hostile to us. And I think the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has been our best defense in that regard, and we need to try to keep that alive, and the President has committed to continue to do what we had talked about doing as part of that treaty, and that is to keep bringing down the U.S. Arsenal of nuclear weapons.
By storage, I was actually thinking about the spent nuclear fuel, the Yucca Mountain debate that we've had for so long in this country.
Yeah, and that's the President, of course, appointed a Blue Ribbon Commission on that to try to come up with a Plan B, since the administration does not support going ahead with Yucca Mountain and essentially has tried to withdraw the application to do that. So I think that we do need good expert scientific advice as to what is a good Plan B. Should we look for another permanent repository, and if so, where should it be? Should we plan on interim storage for a long period of time, and in some perhaps regional locations? What is the right answer? And I don't think we have that answer yet. I hope this Blue Ribbon Commission, which is expected to report this summer, will give us some recommendations.
I want to get one more question on the table and then get to our callers, our Twitter followers, and also our emailers this morning, and that's on the ethanol debate. I'm wondering how you feel about ethanol policy, corn price supports, given some of the facts we've learned about it, what it's doing overall to actually add to some of the carbon issues with the transportation, food price effects, and that sort of thing. Are you a supporter of our current ethanol and corn policy?
Well, I've supported beginning to reduce the amount of subsidy that's provided to ethanol. We tried, in fact, in this last lame duck session, we tried to get agreement to go ahead and reduce the amount of that subsidy fairly significantly, I think about 20% reduction in that subsidy, and then phase it further down in the coming years. I think that's the right way to go. I don't think we can justify maintaining the current, I think it's 45 cents per gallon subsidy that we provide to ethanol. But we also, of course, need to keep every effort going to develop this so-called cellulosic biofuel, where we're not dependent upon corn as the feedstock for the biofuel that we're using.
Do you mind if I ask what you're driving these days?
I'm driving a Prius. Yeah.
And how's that going for you?
Well, it's going fine. I've been real glad not to have to pay so much for gasoline.
Let's get the calls for you. Eagle River, Wisconsin. Ron is a Democrat.
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning, Ron.
Morning.
Yeah, I'd like to. When is Congress going to be honest with the American people, sir? You mentioned clean coal. Clean coal is a lie. It's spread by the coal industry, who lobbies and pays Congress. Nuclear is way too expensive and takes way too long to develop. Oil is in charge of Washington until the last drop is gone, sir. And why aren't we developing biodiesel in this country? It can be made from any kind of vegetable oil, or even any kind of even hemp seed oil can make biodiesel, and it's way less corrosive than ethanol. And the mileage, I have an 07 diesel truck I bought. It's a 3/4 ton. I get 23.8 on the highway. That's better than any gasoline truck you could ever mention. And it's a 3/4 ton truck.
Thank you, Ron.
Well, I agree that we need to promote the development of biodiesel. That certainly makes sense, and I agree with some of the other points about the high price of building a new nuclear power plant. There's no question that it's extremely expensive these days, and I think we need to get to a point. The ideal thing would be to get to a point where utilities can choose between various clean forms of energy on the basis of the economics, and that's what I think we would try to do. On clean coal, I think that there is the technology to go ahead and do carbon capture and storage, take the carbon that comes from coal and sequester it underground. And that has not been proven at scale. We haven't been able to demonstrate that that would be the solution to our coal plants, but I think that there is such a thing as clean coal. At least it's been demonstrated that that can be done in some cases, and whether we can do it more broadly, that's what we're trying to determine.
We've just gotten the job numbers in, and let me tell you the top line, and I'll provide more detail later. AP Bulletin, economy adds 36,000 jobs in January. Unemployment rate in the United States falls to 9%, the lowest since April of 2009. Would you like to react?
Well, 36,000 is a disappointing number. Obviously, the expectation that I heard was that it would be substantially more than 100,000 jobs, private sector jobs that people would expect would have been created in January. So that's a disappointment. And the other figure, the unemployment figure, it's always nice to see unemployment coming down, but until we get more explanation of exactly how that figure was arrived at, sometimes that reflects more how many people quit looking for work than it does actual number of folks getting a job.
What is the situation with employment in New Mexico?
Well, in New Mexico, we're a little bit better, just very modestly better than the country as a whole. I think unemployment in our state, I haven't seen the figures this morning, but about 8.5%.
And why is it doing better?
I think our state, New Mexico, does better because we have a lot of public sector employment in New Mexico. We have quite a few. We got four military bases. We've got a couple of large Department of Energy laboratories. We've got a lot of folks whose jobs are public sector, and therefore, as the economy reduces, their jobs are somewhat more stable.
Well, then that leads right into the debate over the budget here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, it sure does.
I'm wondering where you see the compromise between the Republicans and the Democrats, especially in the Senate side, over the need to cut versus the concerns over the economy.
Well, I'm not sure where the compromise will wind up being. I think my own position would be that we should heed the advice that Ben Bernanke, Chairman Bernanke, has been giving us, and that is that we need to put in place a long-term plan with some teeth in it to begin bringing down the deficit, both by spending reductions and revenue increases, but that we should not be doing that immediately. We shouldn't be slamming on the brakes of this economy right now. I think these job figures would reinforce that perspective. We need to create over 100,000 jobs each month in this country in order to meet the folks that are coming into the workforce for the first time, meet the needs of jobs for those folks. So if we're only creating 36,000, then obviously the economy is still anemic, and we need to be sure we don't make it more anemic by cutting back on spending dramatically and precipitously.
Next call for Senator Bingaman is from Old Town, Maryland. This is Philip, who's a Republican. Good morning, Philip.
Okay, I wanted to ask the senator, or I wanted to remind him that most every time, now I'd like to have been on at 8:30, but I couldn't get on. Most every time that jobs and so forth is brought up, we talk about the Social Security, having to cut that so we can, Social Security and Medicare. Well, I would like to remind the Senator, since 1935, when Social Security was first instituted, the Congress of the United States have borrowed $9 trillion from that fund to keep Social Security and Medicare secure, not cut it in any way, shape, or form. Every time they went back to the Congress, back to Social Security for money, they said, we're borrowing money. They didn't say we're stealing it, with never the intention of paying it back. They said they were borrowing. Please consider this.
No, I think the caller makes a very good point. Social Security is not contributing to the deficit at this point. In fact, we are using revenue from Social Security, being paid in for Social Security, to meet other needs of the government at this point. So I think his point is well taken, that in order to get Social Security on a footing where it can be projected to be solvent for 75 years, which is what I think the administration would like to see, and many experts would like to see. I think some adjustments could be made. That doesn't mean you have to change benefits. It doesn't mean you have to reduce benefits.
Tweet from Dingo Star, who asks, Senator Bingaman